In the following video, note what strengthens the faith of one of our brothers who is a scientist.
As a mechanical design educator, I view even natural things from a design perspective. Mechanical design considers not only the individual components of a machine, but also how they interact. From this viewpoint, human vision is a magnificent example of design. For a single eye, the cornea, the iris, and the lens interact to focus an image on the retina. The light-sensitive cells of the retina, called photoreceptors, produce nerve signals. Signals from the rod and cone photoreceptors are transmitted by the optic nerve to the brain, where they are processed to produce a perceived image. Now, just imagine the multiplied complexity when two eyes interact. Particularly mind-boggling is the amount of information being constantly processed by more than 130 million retinal receptors and then transmitted through the 1.2 million nerve fibers of the optic nerve to the brain. To me, the sheer complexity of how all these components flawlessly interact is evidence of a superior designer. Some disagree. They propose that the eye evolved from a light-sensitive patch in some ancestral creature through small random changes. I find the proposed process unrealistic. Unlike design, it is unplanned and without a goal. We are asked to imagine that a complex system can develop without direction, while in the natural world, things tend to become disorganized. But consider something even more mind-boggling. The design of the eye, the optic nerve and brain, and how they function and interact are completely documented in our DNA. In fact, our DNA contains all of the instructions for building an entire human body. While science relies only on physical explanations, many individual scientists reason that highly ordered natural systems are evidence of a designer. My personal conclusion is that there is a God who is revealed in the magnificent designs of nature.
So, as if David Schaefer's anti-science tirade couldn't get any worse, we now have a mechanical engineer, retired, wheeled out to teach us about biology. Am I the only one who's thinking, your specialization is not biology? You haven't learned anything unique. Your professional discipline hasn't given you any special insights into the things of which you are talking. How are the unscientific opinions of a professor in mechanical engineering regarding evolution of any relevance at all? And I did some digging on this guy. You'll have noticed in the caption, he is described as Professor Emeritus of Mechanical Engineering, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, United States. This is Dr. George Zinmeister. There's very little that comes up on Google about him. It seems that he retired as far back as 1999, so thankfully this guy's been out of circulation, put out to pasture over 2 decades ago, so he's gratefully in no position to be pushing his Jehovah's Witness indoctrination on his students. But it's interesting how he presents himself at the beginning. He says,
as a mechanical design educator,
a mechanical design educator, even though, again, as far as I can tell, he's been retired for over 2 decades. So how is he still an educator? Would it not be more honest to say, as a retired mechanical design educator? And furthermore, how did he become a mechanical design educator? How did he become a professor emeritus of mechanical engineering? By going through higher education. And yet, what did Mark Sanderson say earlier, literally in the talk that preceded this talk? What did Mark Sanderson have to say about higher education?
Perhaps we left promising careers. Perhaps we left fame. Perhaps we gave up higher education, or whatever it may be.
Apparently, when it suits Mark Sanderson and the governing body, Jehovah's Witnesses should be giving up higher education, but also when it suits them, they're willing to wheel out retired mechanical engineering professors to lecture us about how evolution is one big hoax. It's all a conspiracy. Biologists who've studied this, unlike Dr. George Zinmeister, biologists who teach us about evolution are all part of some satanic conspiracy. They're trying to fool people. They're pushing this at the behest of Satan and the demons. Well, what have we heard that debunks evolution? We've heard the argument, essentially, of irreducible complexity. I'm dignifying it, by the way, by calling it irreducible complexity. He's really just arguing about complexity. In other words, the eye is so complex, how could it possibly have arisen as a result of natural processes without an intelligent designer? The argument of irreducible complexity says, how do you go from no eye to an eye? In other words, how can you have like half an eye? Of what use is half an eye to an organism? Surely you either have an eye or you don't have an eye. What would the between stages look like? Well, Richard Dawkins deals with this in his book, The God Delusion. And I realize, for those of you who follow what goes on in the atheist community, Richard Dawkins has had some silly things to say recently about trans people. But I'm going to put that to one side for now and focus on his knowledge when it comes to his field, which is biology and evolution. Notice what he says in his book, The God Delusion. Creationists who attempt to deploy the argument from improbability in their favor always assume that biological adaptation is a question of the jackpot or nothing. Another name for the jackpot or nothing fallacy is irreducible complexity, or IC. Either the eye sees or it doesn't. Either the wing flies or it doesn't. There are assumed to be no useful intermediates, but this is simply wrong. That's on page 148. On page 149, rather than read the whole thing, I'll get to the point. What is the use of half an eye and what is the use of half a wing are both instances of the argument from irreducible complexity. A functioning unit is said to be irreducibly complex if the removal of one of its parts causes the whole to cease functioning. This has been assumed to be self-evident for both eyes and wings. But as soon as we give these assumptions a moment's thought, we immediately see the fallacy. A cataract patient with the lens of her eye surgically removed can't see clear images without glasses, but can see enough not to bump into a tree or fall over a cliff. Half a wing is indeed not as good as a whole wing, but it is certainly better than no wing at all. Half a wing could save your life by easing your fall from a tree of a certain height, and 51% of a wing could save you if you fall from a slightly taller tree. Whatever fraction of a wing you have, there is a fall from which it will save your life where a slightly smaller winglet would not. The thought experiment of trees of different height from which one might fall is just one way to see, in theory, that there must be a smooth gradient of advantage all the way from 1% of a wing to 100%. The forests are replete with gliding or parachuting animals, illustrating in practice every step of the way up that particular slope of Mount Improbable. So Dawkins deals with both eyes and wings, and I realize that this mechanical engineer is focusing purely on eyes. And again, he's not even dealing necessarily with the irreducibly complex part. He's just saying, oh, as a mechanical engineer, how could this not be designed? So I'm kind of dignifying him a little bit by making his argument more sophisticated than it is. But it's worth laboring this point, that complexity by itself doesn't get you to God. just because something is sophisticated, just because it does something difficult and it does it so well that you couldn't imagine not having it or only having half of it, doesn't mean that all life zapped into existence 6,000 years ago in a garden with a talking snake. And finally, I love that this guy, this mechanical engineer, George Zinmeister, points to DNA as evidence debunking evolution. He says,
The design of the eye, the optic nerve and brain, and how they function and interact are completely documented in our DNA. In fact, our DNA contains all of the instructions for building an entire human body.
he's pointing to DNA as evidence debunking evolution, even though DNA is, in my view, one of the most compelling lines of evidence that life did evolve by natural selection, as evidenced by the fact that we share DNA with oak trees, we share DNA with fruit flies, we share DNA with rats, and we share DNA with chimpanzees. But guess which of those we shared the most DNA with? To the point where there's almost a negligible difference in DNA between humans and chimpanzees. I've just Googled it, and it's 99% of our DNA. 99% of our DNA is shared with chimpanzees. When it comes to how much of our DNA we share with trees, well, that's 50%. Half of our DNA, half of the chemical instructions in our bodies is shared with trees. 60% of our DNA we share with bananas. So quite clearly, if you're going to argue against evolution, you don't want to be invoking DNA, do you? Because DNA actually tells us about our kinship with the natural world and the fact that all living things very much do share a common ancestor.